For those of you who have just arrived, my name is Renee Fox, and I am a co-director of the Center for Monster Studies, and also an associate professor in the literature department here. I am very, very excited to be able to introduce our upcoming panel. One of the central features of this year's Festival of Monsters is an exhibition up on the third floor of this museum that focuses on monsters in comics art drawn by women. And so we have been thinking a lot as we've been planning this festival about monsters and comics and the relationship between the two of them. And we were so excited when our wonderful humanities development person, Carrie Napoles, told us about her friend Justin Hall and the queer horror anthology that he had co-edited with a colleague of his. And so Carrie put us in touch, and we had this amazing conversation with Justin, and we're like, you must come to the Festival of Monsters and bring your Theater of Terror people with you. And so they agreed, and we are ecstatic to have them. So our three panelists today are Robyn Adams. At age 22, Robyn self-published the 1992 three-issue comic book series Homozone 5, a dramatic story of a team of trans femmes endowed by the goddess, this is amazing, with superpowers in a dystopian future San Francisco. And issue 1 of that is online at homozone5.com. Robyn also published the trans femme zine Venus Castina, as well as a trans short horror story for John Macy's Tropo Comics. After a long time away working in the animation industry, she returned to comics in 2016 with a short bisexual story in the Alphabet Anthology, published by Northwest Press, and followed that up with Dead Name No More in the Theater of Terror gay horror anthology, edited by Justin Hall and William O. Tyler. She's currently working on an adaptation of the 1991 drag queen sci-fi film Vegas in Space, starring Doris Fish. Long fascinated by transgender history, she's the creative director of the Louise Lawrence Transgender Archive and the Doris Fish Archive. Her personal website about her gender transition is robynredress.com. Our second panelist today is Justin Hall, who is a cartoonist, educator, and scholar. He's the creator or the co-creator of True Travel Tales, Hard to Swallow, and Theater of Terror, Revenge of the Queers, and his work in publications such as the Houghton Mifflin Best American Comics, Best Erotic Comics, and the SF Weekly. He edited the Lambda Award-winning and Eisner-nominated collection No Straight Lines, 4 Decades of Queer Comics, and was producer of the award-winning feature-length documentary film of the same name. We're just gonna call him Justin. Justin is the chair of the MFA in Comics program at California College of the Arts, the first Fulbright Scholar of Comics, and has curated international exhibitions of comics art and written about comics for various academic publications. He's currently at work on a graphic novel weaving memoir with LGBTQ San Francisco history for Abrams Books. Our third panelist, William O. Tyler, is a queer Black comic creator and film critic whose work often focuses on the intersections of love and horror and the representation of marginalized people. His current works include the high-anxiety comic Anxious Acts, I love that, a high-anxiety comic, the sexually liberating modern-day Greek myth comic Siren.0, Siren.0?
Siren Zero, yeah.
Siren Zero, okay, and Cinephilia, which focuses on his obsession with film. William self-publishes through Tanis Comics, which he started with his partner, Dave Davenport. He has also co-edited the queer horror anthology, Theater of Terror, Revenge of the Queers, with Justin for Northwest Press, co-edited the queer erotic anthology, Yellow is the Warmest Color, with Sonia Saturday for Trash Panda Fun Zone, and is currently co-editing the queer Black anthology, We Belong, with Victor Kearney for Stacked Deck Press. And our 3 Theater of Terror editors and contributors are going to be in conversation with our own Michael Chemers, director of the Center for Monster Studies. So I will turn things over to him.
Thank you so much, Renee. Yes, thank you. Welcome to our panel. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming back after lunch. Much appreciated. My werewolf baby is just going to sit here, I think, a little while. Hopefully that's not going to fall down. Thank you for those wonderful introductions, Renee. Theater of Terror, and would you hold it up there, Justin?
Yeah.
Is a horror anthology featuring a remarkable collection of talented LGBTQ cartoonists illustrating in vivid detail what keeps them up at night. Very beautiful. Yeah. And I'm reading from the description of the book, with everything from gore to suspense to supernatural horror to camp. This tome of shocking queer horror comics, this is a tome of shocking queer horror comics we dare you to read. And it is a wonderful book. I have devoured it myself, unfortunately only in PDF form because it's out of print. But you can get it from the publisher for download for not very much money, so that's a really good thing to do. And we've got also some images from the anthology are going to be up here on the screen. Let's start with you, Justin, if you don't mind. How did this grouping of artists come into being?
So here, if you see on the cover here, you see Peaches Christ. Peaches Christ is a sort of legendary horror queen, drag queen in San Francisco, who's often associated with the Castor Theater. And so I had approached Peaches to be a sort of crypt keeper character. She would rather prefer to be the Elvira character as opposed to crypt keeper, sort of to be the horror hostess of a collection of queer horror comics. So Peaches and I talked this over, agreed that this was going to make a great book, and started in on gathering some people and realized it was going to be a lot of work. And so I turned to my friend William and was like, help me. So the two of us co-edited the book, brought in all these different creators, and really we tried to be really gather groups of people who would have different takes on the work, right? I think one of the things that was most interesting to us was that horror is such a sort of fungible genre that you can really get all different kinds of material, especially when you're thinking through a queer lens. Everything from, camp humor to, psychological terror to gore and body horror, right? You can really get all these different sort of things through a queer lens and using the genre of horror. So, and William is much more of a horror expert than I am. So we really had some good conversations with that and brought in some interesting people. It was, a lot of work, of course, but yeah, we're really happy with how it all came out. So yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Why is it important, and this is for any of you to respond to, why is it important to have queer spaces in comic books? That's a silly question, really.
Well, it's just important to have, queer spaces everywhere.
Everywhere.
We're here, and so we want to tell stories. As a creator, we want to tell stories. These are the types of stories we can tell, and as readers, they also want to see themselves, and they want stories that they can relate to, or stories that help them through whatever they're going through, because queer people always are going through something. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, Robyn. Any?
Well, I think that for one, like I don't know if you've ever spent any time in comic book culture or online comic book culture. Yeah. It pisses a lot of people off to have queer spaces for comics.
Absolutely.
So good. And it's just really important that the larger culture have a sense that there are other stories to be told, and there are other ways to look at life, and the assumption of heterosexuality on any of your characters shouldn't be a given.
Right.
I would also just say that representation really matters. I mean, I think it can. I mean, not to sound cliche, but it can literally save lives. I mean,
absolutely.
To see oneself represented in some way. And then horror is a particular genre that I think is interesting to subvert for our own purposes, because so often monsters and villainous characters in horror are queer-coded or very directly queer. Right. And for us to take over that space a bit and tell it from our perspective is really powerful.
Absolutely. Let's drill down on that a little bit. Give me a for instance.
I mean, I could do any horror as a for instance. There's so many ways to read horror as queer. something like my favorite horror movie, Carrie, where this character has been marginalized not only in school but also at home. And so
Right.
she is literally in a league of her own. She's trying to navigate the world herself. And when she sets the prom on fire, I'm like, good for her. It kind of is that release of like, you've been building up all this tension, you as in society towards the queer person has been building up all this tension that this queer person has to, and this is a queer read, Carrie isn't necessarily a queer character, but we can read into horror that way, but this character has been holding all of that tension, and in order for her to survive, she has to release it.
Right.
And society is the one who threw all of it at her, so she's throwing it back at them. And I find that very inspirational as a queer person, that, I see myself in villains and monsters all the time. I don't see it as a negative. I see it as I can relate to this character because they've gone through something that's similar to what I've gone through.
Right. We talk a lot, my students and I talk a lot about identifying with the monster, right? And seeing your own struggle in the monster. When that happens, you're on the gateway of genuine self-discovery, right? As opposed to always seeing the other in the monster, which is setting you up to commit atrocities or persecution against somebody, right? Yeah. So you mentioned, what are some, you mentioned about representation, as you say, it matters. It certainly does matter. What are some good titles in queer horror comics that you guys are looking at right now? Is there a robust field?
I wouldn't say exactly robust, but there's, you certainly see, there's important sort of moments in queer horror in horror comics. You've got the EC material, which is
yeah.
right, so which was entertaining comics, pre-code. So not to go down a rabbit hole of comics history here, but 1954 there was the Comics Code Authority came through, and basically it's probably the most severe censorship of any art form in American history, and basically sort of sliced out, knocked out all the material before that at its knees. So crime comics, horror comics, romance comics were the biggest genres in comics in America at that point, in the late 40s and early 50s. And after the Comics Code Authority happened, everything, all that was left, all that stuff was wiped away, and everything that was left was sort of sanitized superhero stuff and Archie, basically. And the comics industry had to sort of remake itself after that. And some of that early pre-code material could be certainly queer-coded. The stuff that happens later in the underground comics and then into like Vertigo, which was an imprint for DC Comics that brought a lot of horror comics back into the American market, especially through British creators. And some of that had some really well-done queer representation in it. So, for example, The Sandman had some early trans characters and queer characters in those pages, which was really important. Also, Alan Moore had queer characters for early on in his work.
Great, wonderful. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd forgotten about that Sandman had so many, such a diverse group of characters, for sure. Renee mentioned that behind you, in the Museum of Art and History, we have an exhibition that we're launching right now called Werewolf Hunters, Jungle Queens, and Space Commandos, The Lost World of Women Comic Artists. That was pretty good. Only been working on it for a year, so I should remember it by now. And we do have actually a complete transcription of the 1954 Comics Code up on the wall up there. Yeah. So you can really see, I think, in our exhibition the effect that the Comics Code Authority had on the creation of comics and particularly on horror comics, obviously, but yeah, absolutely. So taking a cue from the last panel, I want to ask the question, is representation enough?
No.
Right? No.
No. I mean, representation is great, like Justin said. It does save lives. It's great for inspiring people. It's great for having people to be able to see themselves. But in the long run, it's not sustainable by itself. So in addition to representation, we also need real life action to make sure those people who, can finally see themselves can also, exist safely.
Right. Right.
And also, I would say that there's a sort of, there can be a trap to sort of the need for one-to-one representation, right? Because that's not necessarily, I mean, first and foremost, you've got to have good storytelling to bring people in, and to have people resonate with the work. So, and sometimes people sort of look for representation in more obtuse ways, right? So I think of the X-Men, for example, that I was obsessed with the X-Men. It definitely has a sort of queer allegory to the idea of mutants, because they, all get their powers around adolescence, and they're fabulous, and they're but persecuted, and it's really sad. But at the same time, they have incredible powers, and they dress better than anybody else.
Oh my God, they are queer.
Yeah, it's totally queer.
I never realized that.
But then, eventually they made actual gay characters in the X-Men, and they were not as interesting to me. I'm still a Storm fan. That's so the idea of that you're going to gel necessarily with the character that is sort of exactly you, I think can be a trap too. But ideally, in a world of better representation, you have all these sort of options, and it's sort of that the boundaries get sort of fuzzy in good ways, right? That you sort of have this whole world that you can connect with.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So that the state of queerness itself is not monstrous, right? But human, and subject to all of the different permutations of what it means to be human. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah. Other thoughts on that?
Well, I was just going to say that, I think in particular for like telling, for instance, trans stories.
Right.
Okay? So trans themes have been popular forever, really, in literature and film and pulp fiction and stuff like that. It's always, of course, seen through a cis lens.
Right.
Tends to be really sort of obsessed with transformation and surgery and all of this stuff, right? All the stuff that makes people uncomfortable,
Right.
And so having having trans creators in the room to tell different stories and different perspectives, I think, advances, obviously, the people's understanding of the transgender experience.
Right.
At the same time, I sort of agree that, when we get our own characters, they kind of suck. And a little bit, there's it's like, where's the, the sort of subversiveness
Right.
Yeah.
that I really like. I mean, we kind of get this sanitized, treatment sometimes.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's sort of like the stuff that I was making in the early '90s when I didn't know what I was doing really, but I just kind of loved the way it made the straight dudes in my art school uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So kind of pushed that edge a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic.
We're in a time right now where a lot of our villains, I've always loved villains, but a lot of our villains, media is trying to explain a lot of our villains and have audiences sympathize with the villains, which means they then become kind of heroic in their story. And I just want someone who's going to set fire to the world. I don't need that kind of. The sympathy for me comes with identifying with someone who is at odds with everything else. And so if you then make that character friends with the hero or redeemable, and in the way that mainstream wants characters to be, then we lose that. That's exactly we lose that subversion.
Mm-hmm. It also feels like there's different sort of generations of representation, right? The sort of early stages, there's this sort of awkward stage of taking a marginalized identity, and then the first direct representations feel like they have to be perfect. They have to represent everybody, who is part of that identity, which is impossible and a trap, right? But at the same time, if you only have one or two characters of that identity, then you have no choice, really. It's only when you get enough of them, then you can have queer villains, you can have queer, side characters, you can have queer protagonists, you can have queer, anti-heroes, you can have all of it, right? And then the more interesting characters start emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. Robyn, you were mentioning the subjects within within horror of transformation and other things that make people feel uncomfortable, but also are critical to the good telling of a good story,
Sure.
right? Are comic books in particular a very good medium for telling that kind of story? For telling trans stories specifically?
Well, I think, yeah, I do. I mean, you know, like for instance, Justin's documentary shows, right? We have actually a great, rich history of queer comics. Rachel Pollack, who wrote the first transgender superhero, was a contributor to this book. I just lost the thread.
Transformational storytelling.
Yeah. Well,
Within
so
comic books.
it's like comics is such a great medium because it's like a relatively inexpensive way to tell as big a story as you want to tell.
Right.
Right.
Because you can put anything into it.
Put anything into it, and you know, so yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a really democratic medium in that way.
Because it's accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my first book, I printed it at Kinko's and,
Really?
you know, sent it out in the world.
Amazing.
So,
It's DIY, right? You could make great comics with a ballpoint pen, some paper, and a photocopy machine if you have
Totally.
to. I mean, it's hard. It's a really difficult medium, but it's accessible. It's democratized in that sense. You know, you don't need the resources that you do for film or for a lot of other forms.
Yeah. I think it was, in fact, that exact democratization of the comic book that made it such a threat in the 50s, right? Was that everybody was reading it. It was the one of the most popular art forms in America at the time. And people were just getting these unfiltered stories that the certain people thought were dangerous, right? Seduction of the innocent and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
And to be fair, like you look at the 1940s Wonder Woman comics. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, that was some subversive shit. Man. The kinkiest, probably some of the most radical stuff ever published in America, I think. And it was a kids comic in the 1940s. So, yeah.
What was it called?
No, it was Wonder Woman.
Wonder Woman.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty kinky, actually.
It's very the lasso of truth, the bracelets
Lasso
of
of
submission.
truth.
I mean, my husband, the poor thing, has seen me gone down this rabbit hole many times, and he knows to back out of the room when I start talking about Wonder Woman. I'm going to spare you, but let's talk afterward. Okay.
what was his name? Marston?
Marston, William Marston. So he was part of a triad, and the woman who was actually that Wonder Woman was based on was the niece of Margaret Sanger, the pioneering first wave feminist, who created the birth control pill in Planned Parenthood. And she wore bracelets to signify her relationship to the family instead of a ring. Those become the bracelets, ching, 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 of submission.
Amazing. That's amazing. I had no idea. So there are a lot of things that you need to think about when you're creating comics that I think most of us readers of comics, I'm an avid reader of comics, but I'm learning a lot in the course of putting this exhibition together about the way you use gutter space, for instance, right? Or the gutters are the spaces between the panels in a comic book. The pacing and building of tension having to do with the turn of a page, right? And then the tension between the text and the image going on here, which is something I always tell my students that comic books are a dramatic medium because they unfold through action as opposed to through narrative, right? So that puts them closer to plays and films and television than it does to short stories or novels, right? Because, anyway, how did those factors come into play in theater of terror? And maybe you can show us some examples.
Mm-hmm. This is from Robyn's story here. Dead Name You No More.
Right, so there I'm breaking the gutters all over the place, aren't I? Yeah. Good for me.
And it's subversive, right? I mean, this is like, I mean, because the gutters are the space between the panels, and this sort of delineates a break in space and time. But of course, your illustration can break through those borders and literally sort of break apart the fabric of space and time. The comics form is it's sort of an allegorical representation of space and time in a static page, and that gives you all this plasticity to play with in a way that you much more so than film or animation, where the relationship to time is pretty much one-to-one, whereas with comics you can play with what time means, and you can layer a time on top of itself, where the text is coming from one time frame and the image is coming from another time frame.
Yeah. We notice, if you go to the exhibit later, you'll see we have an entire Lily Renee comic from 1947. And one of the interesting things about that comic is that even though there are a lot of scantily clad ladies running around, so it obviously appeals to that particular gaze, nevertheless, the ladies have a tendency to not want to stay in their panels. And their legs and their hair and their arms and stuff are violating the boundaries of those gutters, right, in really cool ways. And it tends to be the women that do that, not so much the men. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, since it's a visual medium, there's really nothing you can't do. I mean, there are definitely rules that you want to stick to in order to have your story be understandable by the reader. But as far as design and creating, there's just so much it's kind of limitless. Like, there are rules, but then you also have fun breaking those rules. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
I would also just say that, like, in terms of how comics are paced, there's actually I mean, you're not going to get the jump scare in a comic that you would in a film. The sort of experience of it is different. But what you can do is you can, the gutter becomes the space where the reader is encouraged to insert their own imagination and their own sort of their own internal description of what's happening. So that's a way to sort of build engagement with the reader that's really specific to the form, and also build tension and pacing. So comics do this really differently than any other medium.
Yeah.
And it's really effective for horror. I think of horror as very similar to erotica, and in that sense, because there's so much of the building of tension and the release of tension.
Yeah.
And thinking about the page turn with the monster reveal, or,
Yeah,
you know.
I was just going to say I actually would disagree that you can't do a jump scare, that you won't get the jump scare, because the page turn can absolutely be a jump scare with the monster reveal.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah, certainly you can get kind of a gasp, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, but then also you can't control the reader in the same way that you would with a director can with a film. So the reader can sit there with one panel, obsess about that panel, look at it again and again and again, right? Really get into the details of it, or they can be like, and move on to the next panel.
Yeah.
You know, it's a really individual experience.
Right. Well, I was thinking about what you said about the gutter being the space where the reader inserts their imagination, right? And that makes me think of the way that we approach thinking about performance.
No.
The performance itself is not really the thing that is in the mind of the audience. The performance indicates that. Mm-hmm. It gestures towards that, but it isn't that. That only occurs in your mind, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that also the case in comic books?
That's a tough one.
Sort of.
Say the last part again. I was looking at my own work.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking that the performance, when we talk about a performance, the performance itself is not the thing that occurs in the mind of the reader, or of the audience member, because the performance gestures towards that thing, indicates that thing. Oh my God, you would not believe what just happened right off stage. Yeah, Oedipus poked out his eyes, right? Yeah. And it's right there, right? But where it really occurs is in the imagination of the audience, right? And it seems to me like comic books are doing a similar move.
Yeah, the gutters are almost like, can also almost be used, as far as horror, can almost be used like what's hiding in the shadow. What, like you're saying, what you don't see, that's still happening.
Yeah.
And there definitely can be, you can set it up so that characters on your page are referring to that as well.
Yeah.
You're encouraged to, even within an action sequence, you're sort of encouraged to imagine what happens between the one panel and the next. Whereas I think some filmmakers can push that as well, but for the most part, you're not really encouraged to imagine what's happening between the cuts. Whereas in comics, you really, to move from one one setup to the other, and with these two different panels, that space in between, you're really encouraged to place your own imagination, and that could be more horrifying if for horror purposes. Yeah.
And how, using that, with that understanding and that flexibility, that incredible, and you were talking about the way the time can get layered.
Yeah.
How do you queer that space, right? How do you transgress in an interesting way that motivates the what you want to achieve with your art?
Yeah. I think certainly the queer gaze, because you mentioned before about how comics are both a visual storytelling medium but also literary, right? So what literary media does particularly well is to get into the interiority of the characters, and so. You can do a bit of both with comics, right? Where you can show things that are happening, but then also get into the head of the character watching these things happening. So you're in a way that you can't really do with film, and then prose you can't do that because you don't see the things, the action happening in front of you. So comics are this sweet spot in terms of that. So that can be a really wonderful place for a queer reading of the thing that is happening in front of you. So yeah, in that sense, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. That's cool. In our work as monster scholars, we often come across monsters that embody anxieties specifically related to relationships of power, right? How we mark certain people as deviant and eligible for persecution, right? We often see anxieties about queer people manifested in monsters, vampires for favorite, but it really could be any kind of a monster could manifest that kind of anxiety. Knowing this, how did you approach these monsters that you created in Theater of Terror?
Go
ahead.
I think it's been mentioned, you mentioned earlier, Justin, that we really wanted to make sure we had a diverse selection of stories and of creators telling these stories. And so we tried not to, I don't think there's a lot of repeat of monster types in this book. As big as it is and as many stories as there are a lot of different monsters. Like we have werewolves, we have merfolk, we have ghosts, vampires. My partner and I worked on a story together where we created our own monster, which is like a vulture creature, a culture vulture. So yeah, there are a lot of queer reads into all kinds of monsters, like you said, and we just wanted to make sure that we had a bunch of different things. Like we didn't want it to feel like just one straight story. This is an anthology of various perspectives.
Right.
I played with the idea of transformation here, having a werewolf transformation, but then it's offset by this other character coming in and transforming into Sailor Moon, or Seaman Moon, but yes. Which, so like queering up the idea of transformation, directly.
Fantastic.
But I mean, Robyn, you totally played with the concept of the ghost.
Yes. Yeah. So Justin and William asked me to participate, and this was kind of my return to comics after a really long time of not doing them. And I wanted to do a trans story, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I wanted to do because I was worried about I'm going to do some kind of trope or there's a lot of tension around trans identification. I didn't want to represent poorly.
Right.
But so I came down. It came down to I was actually working for a transgender historical archive in Vallejo, and was doing this project with these scrapbooks that were kept by trans women in the 1950s and 60s. And these were photographs of private parties. These were cutouts from magazines, documenting their trans identity. And for many of them, they quite possibly passed their lives with not anyone ever knowing who they were. And I decided that seemed like a really scary thing to do, especially if you were going to wake up as a ghost and everyone was misgendering you. So that's how I ended up with a very angry female poltergeist in this haunted house. And it turns out that the former owner of the house was, one of these one of these early trans women, and who had this whole life and then passed away and just didn't want to be remembered as their male person.
Right.
So they just haunted the place and Scooby-Dooed it until everybody recognized their identity.
Yeah, wow.
It's
And,
brilliant.
Brilliant.
yeah. So I was happy with it, and then I cast myself as the lead character just because, why not?
Why not? Absolutely. What's the relationship between camp and monsters?
Well, for me, because I love monsters so much, I also want to have fun when I'm working with them. And horror in general can be traumatic. Like we're pulling from a lot of trauma to tell these kinds of stories, and putting our characters through a lot of trauma. So if we can make it more entertaining by making it fun at the same time, why not?
Yeah.
That's where camp and horror work so well for me.
Yeah.
I think camp has also been a survival mechanism for queer people, having a sense of humor that sort of enables you to, humor is survival, right? Like you have to, if you can't laugh. So camp humor has always been a way that queer people have been able to sort of subvert what's happening to them and make it their own and live through shit.
Right.
So it becomes a defense mechanism and a weapon, and should absolutely be part of our cultural legacy and should be part of our work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Wonderful. Renee wants me to ask a question about the relationship between the frame narrative that you put into Theater of Terror, because it's sort of a there's an overarching narrative, and then all these other stories are sort of hung from this narrative in a way. What is the relationship between those two, between the frame narrative and the individual stories?
Mm-hmm. The basic concept was that this is in the future, and Peaches Christ. So by the way, here's some the papers that were sort of in between the stories, which were created by Michael Wirtz, who did the end papers as well. And this is Peaches Christ. It's various versions of Peaches Christ in the Castro Theater, sort of haunting the Castro Theater, and that becomes the basis of the story that we used. So this is a couple of pages from the framing story. Basically, it's in the future. All of San Francisco is this apocalyptic hellscape, and the only thing left standing is the Castro Theater. And of course, these people go into it, explorers, and they realize that there's Peaches Christ haunting the Castro Theater. And Peaches immediately takes these people, puts them into the chairs, Clockwork Oranges their eyes, and forces them to watch all of these films, which are, of course, the individual stories. And by the end of it, they are transformed. They're dead, but of course transformed into fabulous ghosts. So there's a lot of queer ghosts happening here in this book, actually. But it was nice to have a framing mechanism, because this is a common trope that happens with a lot of horror comics, where you have these framing narratives that then, like the Crypt Keeper or Elvira,
right.
Who then can display the individual stories. Yeah.
Very cool.
It was really fun to do, like to really just dig into Peach's character and the Castro Theater and the legacy of the Castro Theater, which is so important in San Francisco. And it was a collaborative effort also. So Peaches helped me write it, and I did the roughs. Tana Ford did the illustrations. William did the colors. No.
Yeah, and it was, as a movie buff, I also enjoyed the fact that we were using Peaches in the Castro Theater to introduce these stories as if they were horror movies. And then we also had other creators who didn't do stories, but did pinups for us that were like mock movie posters that would be in the lobby.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's a lot of fun playing into both comics and movies, and how both mediums kind of see horror.
Yeah.
This is an example of one of the. So Trinidad Escobar was supposed to be with us. Unfortunately, had a family emergency. But this is the piece that she put together for the book, which was it's all of the pinups were supposed to be sort of movie posters for queer horror movies that never happened. Yeah. And this is Kiss of the Aswang. Trinidad does some really beautiful work. drawing on her Filipino heritage to create horror comics using characters from Filipino culture. So the Aswang is sort of a Filipino sort of version of a vampire. So that was important for us too, to draw not just Western monsters and horror tropes, but also go beyond that.
That's great. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I think I'd love to open it up to the audience for a little Q&A. And so Renee is going to grab the podium mic. Who's got some questions for the panel? I see Blake back there.
Thank you.
The answer is no. No, I'm sorry. I mean, it's yes, actually. It's yes. It's totally yes.
It's always yes.
Maybe? I don't know.
42, isn't it?
42. It's 42, yeah.
First of all, thank you for the panel today. My question, I think, relates a little bit to Michael's question about cultural kind of fears and anxieties that are then kind of translated into monsters. So, of course, as queer storytellers, our queer kind of anxieties are very different from those of a non-queer gaze. So I'm curious about how you all approach those. I know Robyn's story particularly, even though I haven't read it, sounded like it was resonating with kind of the queer anxiety that I feel of this problem of erasure and assimilation even. I know personally there's like this kind of worry that I have that like a very sanitized version of what a queer person is kind of being like valued over, you know, a large, the concept of being unidentifiable, right, and being queer. So trying to put a label on those things is very scary to me. And I'm just curious how you as storytellers approach that, but also like navigate the relationship between being queer and monstrous. I know one of the things that I found a lot of comfort in monster studies when I first started was this notion that the monster had power over the majority. It was feared, it was a force to be reckoned with. And that to me is kind of like part of what, you know, even though I didn't feel that in my personal life, you know, trusting that it was like that made me feel so much better, and one of the reasons I got into monster studies. But how do we move, I guess, navigate moving forward with knowing that relationship while also being accepted, you know, accepted without assimilating, I suppose?
Professor?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's a big one. I don't want to be assimilated. I want to be accepted. So I hear I hear your plight. I think we can do that by being loud, being loud as fuck. Like that's sort of like. So you know, kind of maintaining a grip on your own sense of identity and the cultural specificity of your own identity, while also being unapologetic about it and not allowing it to sort of be whitewashed or subsumed. And I think there is a sweet spot there, actually, demanding acceptance without assimilation.
Yeah, being unapologetic about it is what it is for me. Definitely, like I mentioned, my partner and I did this story in Theater of Terror where the villain is a culture vulture. And so the story is, I'm black, my partner's white, and the story is about a black guy who meets a white guy, both gay, on dating apps, and they go home together, and it turns out that this white guy is a culture vulture and is only there because he wants to steal this black guy's culture. And it's about, you know, it's about that. It's about appropriation. And so I think it's important when we're telling stories that we're very unapologetic and authentic about what we're feeling and what's scary and true. Just talk about what it is that's bothering you, like authentically.
Yeah.
This story is amazing, and here's a panel from it. So, I was the story that I wrote a few of the stories in the book, but then the one that I illustrated was about sort of it's very camp. But this one character is, you know, deciding between becoming a werewolf and this sort of group of very much like hypermasculine gay men and wanting that sort of sexiness, but at the same time also wanting to be very much a queer person and become part of the Seaman Moon crew of like magical queens that save the universe, and then being like, why can't I be both? So at the end of the last image is of this werewolf in a Sailor Moon outfit. So I mean, that's, you know, we can be whatever we want to be.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I just feel like I want to be able to tell stories that mean something to me without having to worry that it's going to be used against me.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, you know, because it's like there's this certain, especially now, like with trans women and everything that's going on in the culture out there, there's just this pressure to sort of be pure, you know, and like we're human beings with messy lives and interesting compulsions, and who knows, you know. And I want to be able to talk about that without being misunderstood. I want to talk about that without contributing to the problem, you know, because it's interesting stuff to grapple with, you know. It's like I have my own like ways that I'm, you know, conditioned by the culture, you know, to have weird ideas about sex and race and gender and everything else, you know, that I want to pay attention to. But yeah, I like a little subversion in my content. Thank you.
That's great. Other questions? Yes, I see it down here. Kathy? Yes, please use the microphone because we're streaming.
You know, as I listen, I mainly work in Southeast Asian stuff, and there the monster is often sacred, or certain of the monsters, things like that. And they are trans, you know, they cross genders and all of those kinds of things. Now, there's various pressures that, you know, people feel today within contemporary Islam or whatever, not to fully own them, but certainly within the gay community or things like that. There are many people who are recuperating that. As I'm listening to you and the stories that you are creating, those are clearly models that have grown up from society, created roles and archetypes of sacred chaos that explains, you know, the important kinds of human feelings or divine feelings, whatever it is, that are part of those cultures. I'm trying to think or asking you if you find, you know, within European or African ancestors or things like that, some of those kind of archetypes that your makers are using, or if you see growing out of the community that kind of monster that, you know, is not a monster, it's the god.
That's interesting. It didn't really come up as much, at least not for me, on Theater of Terror. But the book that I'm currently working on now, I'm currently editing a book called We Belong, which is all queer Black stories. And we had an open call for submission, and we had a lot of pitches from Black creators, queer Black creators, who wanted to tell stories within non-Black cultures. It was very interesting. And so we had a big discussion about, like, instead of, you know, if you want to tell a story about gods, instead of using Greek gods, how about using African gods? And so we had a long discussion and a lot of research about that, because we are very accustomed to certain, especially being here in America, we're accustomed to certain things, and being part of the diaspora that is kind of disconnected from Africa. It's a lot to have to conquer and ask yourself and challenge yourself on. It didn't really happen with Theater of Terror that much, though, did it?
No, I think you're right. Not as much as, I mean, you do get a lot of horror that comes out of certainly responses to religion and to sacred traditions, both in sort of interesting and not so interesting ways. I mean, certainly you get a lot of like Catholic imagery and a lot of Western horror, for example, for sure. But we did get a lot of that with Theater of Terror.
Yeah.
So I don't. Yeah. I have traveled quite a bit in Southeast Asia, and there was part of a group to support Cambodian and Khmer language comics, and horror is such a huge genre in that area. It's and their approach to it is very different. I agree. It does connect with these ideas of both the sacred and the profane, and really different sort of ways than happens here. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, I haven't spoken all day. I've just been listening. So my question is about kind of related to something you said and something you said, where you said that representation is not enough and action is necessary. And you brought up the idea of wanting to, one of your main goals to be able to tell your stories and express yourself artistically without it being thrown back at you or used against you or having you be misunderstood. And so I was thinking about that because I work a lot in the intersection of theater and action and art and politics, and I work with a lot of drag queens. And there was this situation recently where there was like a community event, Pajaro Valley Pride, and there was a drag artist that I'm friends with who did an act that was horror inspired, and it was very like, sexy woman picks up the phone and is like, hello, and there's like a killer on the other line, and then she like does a big reveal and dances and stuff, and it was amazing. But there were a lot of children in the audience, it was uncomfortable for me as someone who does political organizing, because I was faced with this question of like, I obviously don't believe that children should be separated from, I don't believe that children should be separated from the aesthetics and conversations of adults. I think that children personally should be allowed to understand mature concepts. But I was wondering, in terms of, do you come against as people who create art and want your potentially art to be of like political value or have to face the fact that it's going to be politicized? Do you worry about feeling like you need to create censor yourself or create a separation between who's going to access it, especially in a medium like comics that has a long history of people trying to censor it because they think that it appeals to children and that these mature concepts are going to hurt children in some way? How do you navigate that? Do you at all?
I will say, for me, my comic work has been kind of a struggle on that fence. It seems like for a long time, now I'm using my actual name, but for a long time I had comics that I was making under my actual name and then also doing some work under a pen name because I was worried that those two fields would mix. But I've gotten to the point now where I'm like, I am who I am, and it is what it is, and you either accept me or you don't. I'm like you. I feel like children understand a lot more than people think they do. Children, they pick up on things whether you want them to or not, so you might as well educate them and let them understand how the world works. And I'm very grateful that I had parents that were like, you can watch whatever movies you want at any age, but we're going to have a conversation about it. We're going to talk about like this stuff is not real, or this stuff is problematic, or we can discuss it. I think that's far more important. Education is far more important than quote unquote protection, I think.
Well, I don't know. This business about drag queens and kids is so irritating. Like, I saw the Rocky Horror Picture Show when I was like 15, and that movie changed my life. Come on.
Yeah.
right? That's you know, I think it's a good thing, you know. Kids see so much today. My son is 15. He's been looking at crazy anime stuff since he was a young kid, you know. But you know, my God, you put a queen in a dress and the world comes to an end, you know. I think that, yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to say about that. And I think I run out of time. So.
No, not at all. There's no.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. I've lost my thread a little bit.
I guess one thing I would just say is that I mean, we have to be cognizant of the readership of whatever we make. I mean, I think that's something that's a good thing to be aware of and to think, you know, consciously about. I don't, you know, I did an erotic series with Dave Davenport called Hard to Swallow. It has pirates all over it, and sometimes kids at conventions would be like, "Pirates!" and come in, no, not your kind of pirates. It's okay, different kind of pirates. But also there, I will say there's one frustrating thing that can happen where this idea that somehow if you create adult material that you're then not allowed to create material for kids, and that's just bullshit. That just really pisses me off. And we are all complex human beings that are capable of all different kinds of creative production, and we contain multitudes. You know, come on. And then also how the sort of hypocrisy, especially around queer content and comics around this sort of thing. My former student is Maya Kobabe, who created the Genderqueer, which is the most banned book in America right now. It's a graphic memoir about being non-binary. And Maya's book is absolutely all ages. There's like this, you know, a panel with M experimenting with a strap-on dildo, and it's like somehow that's, you know, and it's so in context, it's so not an issue. It's not considered salacious. It's not, but you know, just the sort of obsessive nature of the criticism of that is so much more indicative of their own kinks than anything that Maya brought to the table, and just really disheartening. So and it's absolutely, it's absolutely clear that these books, the majority of them are queer that are being challenged right now. So there's this fear of a queer voice still, and especially in a comics field, which is still unfortunately associated with kids material. There are great kids comics, but there's also great prose books for kids, right? It doesn't mean that all prose has to be for children, but we're still sort of stuck with that legacy where people think of comics as something for children, which is just not true necessarily. So, yeah.
I'm going to be very interested to see what happens if I get this Vegas in Space comic book finished. So Vegas in Space is a 1991 drag queen movie. It was filmed in apartments in San Francisco in the 80s. And it's an all-drag cast. And really, for the most part, it's a completely family-friendly movie. I mean, there's really nothing in it that would get you, even a PG rating, I think, you know. But they're drag queens, and, you know, they take pills and change their sex and go on an adventure. And, you know, just that idea alone for some people is so completely subversive and threatening. You know, that, right? It's like, well, when I was a kid, you know, I mean, I'm trans, so give me a break, but like I was fascinated with like all ways, you know. There's an episode of The Munsters where Eddie Munster drinks Grandpa's sex change potion and turns into this adorable little girl. And I was just like, oh my God,
I've never seen
so
that
good.
episode. I need to go find it.
So good.
Well, and then there's Ozma of Oz, right? Ozma was a little boy who goes into Oz and then transforms into a magical princess and decides that she wants to stay a magical princess because would you rather be a...
Why not?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you know, concepts of queerness and especially around gender, I mean, they're legion. There is a sort of interesting thing I think that's happening now. I mean, you're talking about having trans creators create authentic stories about transness, and it is there's been sort of magical transness that's been around for forever. But then there's something quite different, I think, about creating stories by and for and about real trans people, which is nice to see that. You know, transness move beyond the realm of sort of magic and become more grounded. Doesn't mean it can't still happen in a horror story, but let's have, how about like a horror story in which the monstrous person is, or the monstrous creature is not trans at all, but maybe a trans protagonist who just happens to be battling monsters. Mm-hmm. Like in your story.
A trans ghost hunter. That's exactly right.
Great. Yeah, I see another hand over here. Go ahead, Anthony.
I have a quick question. So I'm the director of sales for Trick or Treat Studios, all this stuff around here. I'm not sure if you caught the panel or not. But when I first started and we came out with the Chucky doll over there, this might be for you. I noticed that you're a big horror movie buff, but I couldn't understand why the Chucky franchise was such a big presence in the gay community. And other than the seed of Chucky and Glenda and things like that, they tend to like all of the movies. So I just wanted to get your understanding on why do you think that is? I think that's one of the things where I've tried to wrap my brain around as a straight male. I don't understand the fascination for that particular movie in itself. So,
well, there's the creator of Chucky is openly queer, and has.
Didn't he do a blurb?
Did he? Is there a blurb? I think we tried to have him do the forward, but we couldn't for some reason. I can't remember what it was. Something didn't work out, but we actually were in talks with him to do something for this book, and it didn't quite work out. But his creation of Chucky, that whole series is embedded with queerness, and maybe it becomes very blatant in Seed of Chucky for sure. But even before that, like the entire series, just Chucky's own. Chucky doesn't take anything seriously. I mean, it's very much how we look at the world in a way that. We're very serious in the world, but we can look at it. It's like we were talking about camp earlier. We can look at things and laugh and go, "Oh, okay, that's." Compared to the stuff I've been through, that's no big deal. We can laugh that off. And Chucky very much is that character that just is like putting his middle finger up to everybody. And then when you introduce Tiffany and Jennifer Tilly, and then you introduce Glenn and Glenda, and it just the new series now has a gay couple as the lead. So it's the series just is queer through and through. Like there's no question about it.
That's great. So Dana? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, the 1950s were certainly a low point in terms of political freedom and all of that. I mean, in every aspect. But the code I wasn't aware of up there. What was going on in the culture that even motivated the creation of a document or something like that? Because early 20th century, there was an awful lot of political freedom in cartoons. Mm-hmm. So how did they reach a point where they actually said, well, we're going to blow back on this and create a document that is so repressive?
Well, it's sort of the first cultural battle around the idea of the teenager, right? So teenagers didn't sort of exist as a cultural category before the, World War II, right? So post-war, there's this idea that there's this sort of separate category that's not fully adult and not fully a child, and actually has a culture that's in opposition to adult culture, and it's prone to juvenile delinquency and being bad, right? So we think of rock and roll as the battle around rock and roll, as for majority culture, of course, it's that's cribbed from Black American culture, which is a whole other issue. But the first battle over the teenager. Cultural identity of the teenager was really comic books. Comic books were read by everybody. And the comics market had started with mostly juvenile material, so anthropomorphic animal, funny books, and superheroes, and then it was very rapidly transitioning into becoming what is true of the Japanese market now, where it's basically sort of every genre, right? This massive marketplace. And crime and horror and romance comics, quite subversive material, were being made, and the teenagers were loving it. and also a lot of the people coming back from the war and who had seen some real atrocities, and they were interested in seeing some of that stuff represented back, and the sort of repressive cultural forces that wanted to reestablish cultural norms in the United States after the war, and wanted to clamp down on this emerging concept of the teenager. They sort of won that cultural battle. They lost it with rock and roll, which Bill Haley and the Comets had the first rock and roll single in the pop charts in 1954, the same year that the Comics Code Authority came out. So they shut down comics. The industry almost collapsed entirely. The majority of publishers went under. And again, the only thing that was left was superheroes, which were there only a couple of them left because they were out of fashion at that point. And then they get reimagined in a few years later and become the Silver Age of comics. And that's why we have this dominance of the superheroes, which is this sort of weird genre. It's because all the other genres were eliminated basically in the 50s. But that's really, I think, what it was about. It mentioned Seduction of the Innocent, there was a book by Frederick Wortham, who is a psychiatrist in New York, who was convinced that comics were leading to juvenile delinquency and wanted to shut all that down. So, put pressure on a Senate investigation. Estes Kefauver, who had presidential ambitions, there was a whole politics around this as well. It's a fascinating history, but that's sort of the general idea. Yeah.
It's all about getting teenagers and repressing them. There's a scene in Rebel Without a Cause where I think it's Sal Mineo.
Exactly. Which is also, so he's talking about Rebel Without a Cause and Rebel Without a Cause is also a gay romance. I mean, through and through, right? And that's shut down, right? I mean, it's absolutely a gay romance between, James Dean and, yeah.
They went after Batman and Robin too.
Oh yeah, and they said he said that in Seduction of the Innocent that Batman and Robin was making all of our sons gay, and Wonder Woman was making all of our daughters lesbian, and fair enough, actually, I'll accept that point, but
That's a bad thing.
right, exactly. Worked out great for me. I don't know, but.
If you want to learn a lot about the effect of the Comics Code on the industry, just check out our exhibition. We got a lot in there. Yeah. Other questions? I see a hand there.
Hi, thank you so much for the panel and all of your comments. So I work on ancient Mesopotamia. I'm at UCLA, and one of the things that I talk with my students a lot about when we talk about really anything in Mesopotamia is that we're dealing with essentially, higher, there we go. Is this better? Yes. Sorry. You think I'd be used to microphones by now? I have to use them when I lecture. We're dealing with essentially kind of social categories that don't really apply, but we tend to be understanding them through bad frameworks in terms of how they would work. So demons and monsters get called good or evil, and these are inherently useless topics. Pazuzu, which most people know from The Exorcist, in Mesopotamia, you'd wear a little pendant because he wards off Lamashtu and she eats babies, and that's arguably worse. And similarly, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, there's a lot of tension in early scholarship because Gilgamesh is hyper-manly, but to quote, he loves Enkidu like a wife. And early scholars don't understand how to reconcile this idea. And also there's a lot of early homophobia in early scholarship. This is a different problem. But the root of my kind of question to you is when you're looking at these categories that we have that may or may not work in ways that serve what you're trying to talk about and what you're trying to express, do you find it more useful or just a different experience to push against them and reinvent them, or to throw them out and make something entirely new, like with the new monster, the culture vulture you mentioned? And how might that experience be different, or just more useful or less useful in one way versus the other?
I think it depends on the specific project, on what you're trying to do. Because I've done both. I've created my own monsters, and I've taken other archetypes and done my own version of those archetypes that worked for me. So I think it really depends on what the specific outcome you want is. Sometimes, like you said, they don't work, and so you do create your own. I enjoy both. I enjoy doing both.
This actually relates to a conversation I have a lot with my students about the concept of what fan art is. And that there's this idea that that if you are doing work that you're taking material that other people have created and sort of you ship them, for example, put them into relationships or queer the material, like what are you doing with that? Who owns that material? But of course, like everything is fan art. Like, I mean, the fact that I had werewolves in Sailor Moon in my story, like that's fan art, right? I mean, werewolves have been around for a long time, and you're building on narrative traditions that have sort of been developed over many years. So we're all sort of functioning within a cultural milieu that we use as the clay to create our own stories. And sometimes you come up with your own character in some way, but even that is going to be. I mean, Culture Vulture is a new character, but it's also sort of adapting concepts from other horror tropes. So what is a truly original work? I mean, I think we're always playing within a sandbox that's has some history to it.
I think we have time for one more. I see one back there. Oh, and Brandon. Okay.
We have time for more than one more.
Okay, we have time for more than one more.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Swiss and from Germany, flown over, so sorry my English. Thank you so much for this panel. I'm myself researching on montage and demontage. I'm a theater scholar, and I'm very much interested in this kind of curating this book and using a stage or theater as a place where every story comes together. And I would love to hear a little bit of your, actually, I understand it as a work of montage, of making an order out of different separate stories that people also put together from different parts that might also be fan culture or something, and how your work was done, because I'm very interested. Did you tell the authors what the story would be that connects their stories, or did you make the story afterwards when you knew what kind of material you're going to stage on the stage that you provide? And I have the impression that it's also, maybe this is a very important work, to provide a stage or a space in that matter where all this can come together. And I imagine that this is a very tricky kind of work, right? So maybe you can tell a little bit about this.
Absolutely. Like we let our creators know what the general concept of the piece was, of the collection was, because it's pretty unique. Like usually when you have an anthology, it's just sort of like you have an anthology. It's just chapter after chapter. But we wanted to again reference this older trope of horror comics where you do have this sort of unifying or structural element. And using Peaches Christ as this horror drag queen, and using the Castro Theater in particular, where so many different kinds of films, and especially cult films, have been shown, was really an important thing, because it gave then the creators a wide playing field, right? You can access everything from the sort of camp that the horror drag queens represent, to the really, to their Hitchcock festivals that happen at the Castro Theater, right? You can access the sort of psychological horror. You can, so that was really important. And then also this sort of flavor of it, like you can see here from the slide we've got here. This is more of the Michael Wirtz. You see there's an organ player who comes up at the beginning of every show at the Castro, and it's got that creepy, Phantom of the Opera sort of thing going on. So there's a definite flavor to the and legacy, cultural legacy, historical legacy to the place itself, which I think hopefully influenced some of the stories.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it did or not. I think maybe it did, but I think that it was a wide enough, the bookend story was a wide enough idea that you could kind of slide anything into that space, and it would still work as long as it felt like a horror story. I mean, we were thinking we want horror stories for this, so. And like I said before, we wanted diverse horror stories, so we wanted to make sure anything could fit. We weren't trying to push anything away. But we did work with the creators just to make sure like the book felt like a whole as well. So
We did do a lot of editorial work, I think, in a way that is sort of unusual for anthologies. Oftentimes you sort of get the creators to contribute whatever they're going to contribute, but I think we actually put a lot of effort into doing editorial work with this, and so mostly for sort of quality reasons, but I think that created a cohesiveness as well.
Yeah, most of the stories have that interstitial type of page between it. But there was, I think, one throwback to the original story in the middle. I mean, to the book in the story, to the middle, kind of like an intermission between the movies or between the stories. So yeah, we did have. I think there were 3 totals. There was the beginning, then the middle spot, and then the end. That kind of let you know that this was still all happening together.
And they were really great editors, I would like to say. It was great to, like I hadn't done a comic in quite a while, and it was, amazing to be able to send my work to Justin Hall and have him tell me what's going on. I got completely stuck, and then in the course of an afternoon over email, banged out the whole thing with the 2 of them, and so that was fantastic. And it's a great thing these anthologies. I mean, because you have people of a variety of publishing experiences. So you're giving other artists a chance to be shown, and then we're also paying tribute to some greats. And the cover is fantastic. It's a great book.
We wanted to be really cognizant, create a sort of generational legacy also. So it's the book has Howard Cruz in it, who's sort of considered the godfather of queer comics. He's a mentor as well, and it's his last published work before he died. And then Rachel Pollack, who we talked about before, who was my writing mentor actually, and she was the first openly trans woman to create work in the American comics industry. And she worked with Maya Kobabe, who is my mentee, was my former student, and that sort of this amazing moment where I could, she could write this script, I was editing it, I was her mentee, and then my mentee, Maya, was illustrating it. It was sort of 3 generations of queer comics creators working on this story together. That's good. That makes the heart feel good. Yeah.
And the cover artist again is
Phil Jimenez, who's actually comes out of the superhero world, does X-Men and Wonder Woman and all this stuff. So again, we had people here who were coming out of web comics and had never published anything in print before, to someone like Phil who's been working in the mainstream industry for decades. So we wanted to sort of bring all those voices together and have that diversity of generational experience as well as other forms of diversity. Yeah.
Thank you so much, you guys. Brandon, I think you had your hand up?
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Yao. I'm sorry for coming in late, but I've already grown so much from what Yao talked about. This is a question maybe about the relationship between subtext and outness, and maybe thinking at the gutter space in that way. I love reading queer horror anthologies that document the different kind of decades of attraction that queer readers had. So for instance, We Belong Dead, 1950s horror really, has lots of sites of identification for queer viewers. And one of the things that stands out to me, I guess this is where the question is I'm really love when there's a sort of, I'm gonna use the word crotchety, I was using an endearing way, but when we're offered new sites of outness, and then there are, myself, I'm very attracted to what might be been thought of as queer baiting, or the more subtextual queerness, and Jeepers Creepers, Fright Night, Sleepaway Camp, all these movies that are fraud identification. And I'm just curious about about the space for more subtextually coded queerness, as opposed to making it immediately available and named for viewers, if I could put it that way, and readers. Yeah.
I mean, I love both. I think there's a space for both. I think it's important to have blatant queer stories that people can relate to, but then I think also we can relate to a lot of other things as well. So I think that both work. It really depends on it really depends on, what kind of a message you want to get out there. I think with this book, we were sure that it was going to be a blatant telling of queer stories. We were very sure of that. But there are stories in it where the queerness the characters just happen to be queer, but there are also, monstrous things happening. So there's a little bit of both as far as what's in this book.
Yeah, I mean, I think in this particular project, it's a lot about taking the subtextual elements of horror and queer elements and making them just as blatant as possible, just to sort of see what happens. But then, there are going to be sort of simmering elements of the background that I wrote. One of the stories here is a Frankenstein myth of a post-apocalyptic Frankenstein. He's the one scientist is growing body parts on the backs of pigs, and those then harvesting them, putting them together as this sort of ultimate character who ends up, of course, being his lover. But then there's all this sort of so there's a direct queer component, but then the sort of queerness of creation of like how do you grow your ideal person? What does that mean? So I wanted that to also have these subtextual elements. So I think you can sort of layer things both ways. But yeah, for the most part, this was pretty damn blatant.
More thoughts? I see a hand down here, Kathy. Here comes the.
Thank you. I had the sense that there was all this suppression in the 1950s and then 1960s, 1970s. San Francisco seemed to be a place where all of this new energy and novels and different material was coming out of the woodwork. Yeah. My question is historically, right now, do you feel San Francisco is the kind of capital that I think it was in the late 20th century of the forefront of this, or has that changed? Is San Francisco just one of many places? So.
That's a fantastic question. It sort of gets at the book I'm working on now, which is a memoir of my time in San Francisco. I moved to San Francisco in 1995, but I'm also I did a series of comics posters for Market Street for the 50th anniversary of San Francisco Pride, of queer San Francisco moments from 1955 to 1970, leading up to the first Pride. And that time period in San Francisco history, it was sort of the epicenter of queer politics in a lot of ways. So a lot of the stuff that you see later in Stonewall and later actually happened, those battles really happened first in San Francisco. So I really wanted to pay attention to that and tell that story to also the population of San Francisco, that we don't lose our own queer history, which is so easy to do because queer history, like comics history, gets swept under the rug, right? It doesn't get transmitted. So my book is in fact, then I take those chapters of queer San Francisco history and I embed it into my memoir. So how does my life as a queer person now in San Francisco, how is it made possible by the sacrifices and the fights and the struggles that went before me, which is absolutely true. I wouldn't be able to have the queer life I have in San Francisco now without the battles fought by the pioneers during that time period. So I'm trying to be very conscious of how history layers itself. And I do think that San Francisco is still a remarkable, a special place, the whole Bay Area. And I think it's, yes, there's a lot more queer communities and open communities and representation in more places in the world now. But San Francisco remains a sort of forefront of queer creative expression and political power that is really quite unique. And I'm proud to be there. I love the city.
It's not as same as it used to be, though. People came to San Francisco in the 70s because you could live on welfare for really cheap. And that's what the artists did. John Waters famously came to San Francisco and just got on the plan and did his work. So for a long time, it was just a really great place to go be as weird and transgressive as you wanted to be, and you would find community there. And now we're it feels like a lot of those folks are scattered to the winds, and our greatest contribution to the world is Twitter. But San Francisco also will rise again as far as that goes. I mean, you're right. Of course, there's a lot of wonderful stuff happening, but it was a very special place. But I think between the 70s and the late 90s, of just amazing stuff that led queer culture in a lot of ways. And now that's dispersed, and now it's global,
We are working on a queer comics festival that will happen in the San Francisco Public Library in February. So it's really wonderful that libraries are now like us. Libraries like comics now. It's a cool thing, and they have resources. So that's the sort of thing we're trying to still keep going in San Francisco.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists.
Okay.